The first time my family asked me for $2 million, my mother was sitting across from me with tears in her eyes. But 3 years earlier, she had laughed when I told her I was taking out a $35,000 loan to start my own business. "You're going to lose everything," she had said. My brother had laughed even harder. "Who is going to pay you for that?" Daniel asked. "You're running a tiny company out of a rented office." I remembered those words years later because they were the reason I never forgot how it felt to be underestimated. My name is Megan Parker, and for most of my life, my family had a very specific idea of who I was. My older brother Daniel was the successful one. He had graduated from a good college, married his college sweetheart, and eventually became a partner at a commercial real estate firm in Chicago. My younger sister, Rachel, was the family favorite. She was charming, social, and somehow managed to make every family gathering revolve around her. And then there was me. I was the daughter who worked too much, dressed too simply, and had what my father called small ambitions. I didn't hate them for thinking that way. At least, I didn't at first. I actually wanted their approval. That was my biggest mistake. After college, I spent 5 years working in operations for a logistics company. I learned how businesses handled inventory, shipping, purchasing, vendor negotiations, and cash flow. Eventually, I noticed something nobody around me seemed to care about. Small manufacturers were constantly losing money because their supply chains were inefficient. So I started helping a few local companies organize their purchasing and inventory systems. At first, it was just consulting. Then one client asked me to manage everything for them. That was when I realized I had a business. I called it Parker Operations Solutions. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't have a fancy office. I didn't drive an expensive car. For the first year, I worked from a tiny rented suite with 2 desks and an old coffee machine that sounded like it was dying every morning. But I loved it. Every new client felt like proof that I wasn't crazy. Then came the family dinner that changed everything. My parents were hosting Thanksgiving at their home in Naperville. Daniel was there with his wife, Lauren. Rachel was scrolling through her phone while pretending to listen to everyone. My father, Richard, was carving the turkey when my mother asked me how the business was going. "Actually, really well," I said. "I signed 2 new manufacturing clients this month." Daniel looked up. "How much are you making now?" I told him. He smiled. "That's revenue, Megan, not profit." The table went quiet. I tried to laugh it off. "I know." My father shook his head. "You should think about getting a real job again." I stared at him. "I have a real job." He sighed. "You know what I mean." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, Meg, you're putting yourself through all this stress for a business that probably won't survive another year." Rachel finally looked up from her phone. "Mom, remember when Megan said she was going to have 10 employees? Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. I looked around that table and realized something painful. They weren't laughing because they were worried about me. They were laughing because they had already decided I wasn't capable of succeeding. I didn't argue. I simply put down my fork. "I think I'm going to head home." My mother frowned. "Don't be so sensitive." I forced a smile. "I'm not." But I was. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop. I looked at my company's accounts. Then I looked at the list of clients I had signed. I had enough cash to survive. More importantly, I had something I hadn't realized I possessed. Momentum. So I made a decision. I stopped trying to prove myself to my family. I started trying to prove myself to me. Over the next 2 years, everything changed. I hired carefully. I reinvested nearly every dollar. I turned down expensive vacations. I drove my old Honda long after I could afford something newer. While my family posted pictures from resorts and expensive restaurants, I spent weekends studying contracts and negotiating vendor rates. Then one Monday morning, a major manufacturing company called me. They needed help. Their existing operations consultant had failed them, and they were losing hundreds of thousands of dollars every quarter. They wanted Parker Operations Solutions to take over. It was the biggest contract I had ever seen. I almost said no. Instead, I spent 3 sleepless nights building a proposal. They accepted. That one contract transformed my company. Within 18 months, I had 27 employees and clients across 3 states. I moved into a beautiful downtown office. And for the first time in my life, I could afford to stop worrying about whether the electricity bill would clear. But I kept my old habits. I saved. I invested. I built reserves. I didn't tell my family how successful the business had become. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply didn't want their opinions controlling my life anymore. Then, one afternoon, my father called. His voice sounded strange. "Megan, we need to talk." "About what?" There was a long silence. "It's about the family business." My family owned a regional construction supply company called Parker Building Materials. My grandfather had started it decades earlier, and my father and Daniel had expanded it into a respected business. I had never been involved. In fact, They had always made it clear that I wasn't needed. What happened? I asked. We're having some cash flow problems. I frowned. How bad? Another pause. Bad enough that we may need outside financing. I leaned back in my chair. How much? My father hesitated. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. About $2 million. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I suddenly remembered that Thanksgiving table. Daniel saying my business would never survive. My father telling me to get a real job. And now they needed money. My money. Still, I didn't agree. I told my father I'd need to see the numbers before discussing anything. The next morning, he sent me financial statements. I opened the first file. Then the second. Then the third. Within 10 minutes, I knew something was wrong. Their company wasn't simply short on cash. Someone had been moving money. And the transactions were connected to a company I recognized immediately. Daniel's name was on it. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. Then my phone rang. It was Daniel. His first words were not an apology. They were a warning. Megan, whatever you think you found in those documents, don't go digging any deeper. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a family asking for a loan. They were hiding something. And somehow, I was already holding the one piece of information that could bring the entire company down. Daniel's warning stayed in my head all night. Don't go digging any deeper. If he had simply denied everything, I might have believed him. Instead, he had sounded afraid. The next morning, I called the company's longtime accountant, Susan Miller, someone I had known since I was a child. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply asked one question. Did Parker Building Materials really need $2 million? Susan went silent. Then she said, Megan, I think you should ask your father why the company owes money to 3 different lenders. My stomach tightened. 3. Yes. That was the first sign that the financial statements Daniel had sent me were incomplete. I hired an independent forensic accountant named Kevin Brooks. I paid him personally and told him I wanted one thing, the truth. For 2 weeks, Kevin examined invoices, transfers, loans, vendor payments, and company records. Then he called me. You need to come in. I drove to his office that afternoon. Kevin placed a thick folder on the table. Your family's company isn't facing a temporary cash flow problem. What is it? It's been covering losses for almost 2 years. He opened the folder. There were dozens of transactions. Payments from Parker Building Materials had been sent to a separate consulting company. That company had only one listed executive. Daniel. I stared at the documents. How much? Kevin turned another page. Approximately $780,000. My throat went dry. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. There had to be. Maybe Daniel had invested company money. Maybe there was some legitimate business arrangement I didn't know about. Then Kevin showed me something else. The consulting company wasn't providing meaningful services. It had been billing Parker Building Materials for vague strategic development, market consulting, and management services. Services that, according to employee records, had barely happened. My brother hadn't simply made a bad investment. He had been draining the family company. But there was another problem. The money wasn't enough to explain the full crisis. Where did the rest go? I asked. Kevin looked at me carefully. That's the part you won't like. He slid another document across the table. A series of transfers had been made from the consulting company into personal investment accounts. One of those accounts belonged to Daniel. The other belonged to someone else. My mother. I stared at her name. No. Kevin nodded slowly. She received approximately $240,000. I couldn't speak. My mother had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. That night, I went to my parents' house. My father opened the door. He looked exhausted. Why are you here? I held up the folder. Because I want the truth. His face changed. He knew. I walked into the living room. My mother was sitting on the couch. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. For the first time in years, all 4 of us sat in the same room without pretending everything was fine. I placed the documents on the coffee table. What is this? Daniel stared at them. My father looked at the floor. My mother started crying. I turned to her. Mom. She wiped her face. I didn't know how bad it was. You knew about the money. She didn't answer. That was enough. I felt something inside me break. Not because of the money. Because I had spent years believing my family simply didn't understand me. Now I realized they understood me perfectly. They just hadn't respected me. Daniel stood. You don't understand what happened. Then explain it. He paced across the room. I borrowed the money because I was trying to save the company. You transferred nearly $1 million into a company you controlled. I was going to put it back. When? He didn't answer. My father finally spoke. We were going to fix everything before anyone found out. I looked at him. Anyone? He lowered his eyes. You mean before the bank found out? Silence. That was when I understood. The $2 million loan wasn't simply about keeping the business alive. The bank was preparing to call the company's existing loans. If that happened, Parker Building Materials could collapse within weeks. And my family wanted me to become the solution. Daniel looked at me. You have the cash. I almost laughed. So that's why you called me. We need you, my father said. I looked around the room. The same people who had told me my business was a joke were now waiting for me to rescue theirs. I could have said no. Part of me wanted to. But I didn't want Parker Building Materials to collapse. There were more than 50 employees who had nothing to do with Daniel's decisions. Families depended on those paychecks. So I made them an offer. I'll consider financing the company. My father exhaled. Daniel smiled. Then I continued. But not through the terms you're expecting. His smile disappeared. I want complete financial control during the restructuring. Daniel immediately shook his head. No. Then find another lender. My father stared at me. What exactly are you proposing? Independent financial oversight. Full access to the company's books. Daniel steps away from financial management, and every transaction involving related companies gets investigated. Daniel's face hardened. You're trying to take the company. No. I looked directly at him. I'm trying to stop you from destroying it. He slammed his hand against the table. You've wanted this for years. I stood. I never wanted your company. Then I said the sentence I'd been holding inside for years. I wanted my family to believe I was worth something before I became successful. Nobody spoke. I left. 2 days later, my father called. He accepted my terms. But before I could finalize the financing, Kevin discovered one more transaction. A payment had been made 6 months earlier. It wasn't to Daniel. It wasn't to my mother. It was to a company I had never heard of. The company had been registered under a different name. Kevin traced the ownership. Then he sent me the paperwork. I read it once. Then again. The company was legally owned by my father. I called Kevin immediately. Why would my father be sending money to his own company? Kevin's answer made my blood run cold. Because I don't think your father was trying to hide money. What was he doing? I think he was protecting something. Protecting what? Kevin paused. Then he said, Megan, I found a document from your grandfather. My heart stopped. What does it say? Your grandfather apparently created a separate ownership agreement years ago. What kind of agreement? Kevin lowered his voice. One that may give you control of Parker Building Materials if the company ever became financially distressed. I couldn't breathe. I had never known about the agreement. My family had spent years telling me I had no place in the business. But now I was beginning to suspect that my grandfather had planned something none of them had ever told me. Kevin sent me the document. I opened it. At the bottom was my grandfather's signature. And beneath it was my name. But there was one final clause. A clause that changed everything. It said that if the company entered a financial crisis caused by mismanagement or misuse of company funds, control could legally transfer to me. I stared at the screen. Then my phone rang. It was my father. His voice was trembling. Megan, please don't use that document. I whispered. Why? My father was silent for several seconds. Then he said, because your grandfather didn't leave you the company. My heart pounded. What are you talking about? He took a breath. He left you something much bigger. And before I could ask what he meant, the call suddenly disconnected. For several seconds, I just stared at my phone. My father's last words echoed in my head. He left you something much bigger. I called him back. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. So I drove straight to my father's house. When he opened the door, he looked older than he had the night before. Daniel was already there. My mother sat quietly in the living room. I walked inside and placed the document on the table. Tell me the truth. My father looked at Daniel. Then at my mother. Finally, he sat down. Your grandfather knew Daniel was reckless, he said. Daniel immediately protested. That isn't true. My father raised his hand. Let me finish. He looked at me. Your grandfather believed you were the only one in this family who understood how to build something from nothing. I felt my chest tighten. Then why did nobody tell me? Because he knew you wouldn't accept the company as a gift. That was true. Even sitting there, I realized how much my grandfather had understood me. My father continued. He created a family trust years before he died. Parker Building Materials was only one part of it. I stared at him. What was the other part? The property. He explained that my grandfather had quietly purchased several commercial properties over the years. Warehouses, industrial lots, and distribution facilities that had increased dramatically in value. Those properties weren't owned directly by Parker Building Materials. They were held inside the trust. And the trust had one condition. If Parker Building Materials became financially distressed because of mismanagement, the person designated to protect the family's long-term assets would be me. I looked at Daniel. You knew. He wouldn't look at me. My father nodded. Daniel found out about the trust last year. And that's when the transfers started? Daniel finally looked up. I was trying to save the company. No, I said quietly. You were trying to save yourself. He didn't answer. The truth was painful, but strangely, I felt calm. For years I had thought my family underestimated me because they thought I wasn't capable. Now I understood. They had underestimated me because they never bothered to see who I had become. I didn't want the company. I didn't want Daniel humiliated. I didn't want my parents begging me for forgiveness. I wanted to stop the damage. So I made one final decision. I would provide the $2 million financing, but only under a formal restructuring agreement reviewed by independent attorneys and accountants. Daniel would surrender financial authority. The questionable consulting company would be dissolved. The missing funds would be investigated and, where appropriate, repaid. My father would remain involved in operations. And the employees would be protected. But I added one more condition. I would not take control of Parker Building Materials personally. Instead, I would appoint an independent management team. My father looked surprised. You don't want the company? I shook my head. No. Why? I smiled. Because I already built mine. 3 weeks later, the financing was finalized. The bank accepted the restructuring plan because my company was providing the capital under strict conditions. The employees kept their jobs. The vendors were paid. The business survived. But Daniel had to face the consequences of his decisions. He resigned from the company. The investigation into the transfers continued, and he eventually agreed to repay a substantial portion through the sale of investments and other assets. My mother returned the money she had received. My father kept the company, but under completely different leadership. For the first time, Parker Building Materials wasn't being run according to family pride. It was being run like a real business. Months passed. I rarely heard from Daniel. My mother called occasionally. My father called more often. But something had changed. They no longer called me the little business owner. They asked for my advice. Not because I was their daughter. Because they finally respected my judgment. One Sunday afternoon, my father came to my office. He stood by the window, looking at the employees working below. You know, he said, your grandfather would have been proud of you. I looked at him. I wish he had told me himself. My father smiled sadly. He tried. I frowned. What do you mean? He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small envelope. My name was written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands started shaking. You've had this all along? My father nodded. I was supposed to give it to you when you were ready. I opened it. Inside was a short handwritten letter. My grandfather wrote that he had watched all 3 of his grandchildren grow up. He loved them equally. But he had noticed something different about me. I didn't need people to hand me opportunities. I created them. At the bottom of the letter was one sentence I will never forget. Never confuse being overlooked with being powerless. I read it 3 times. Then I cried. Not because of the money. Not because of the company. Because for the first time, I realized my grandfather had believed in me long before I had learned to believe in myself. A year later, Parker Operation Solutions had grown again. We opened offices in 2 additional states. I hired more employees. And I finally replaced my old Honda. Not with something extravagant. Just a comfortable car I genuinely liked. I still kept my grandfather's letter in my desk. As for my family, things never returned to the way they were. And honestly, I didn't want them to. Some relationships don't need to be restored exactly as they were. Sometimes they need to be rebuilt with new boundaries. One Thanksgiving, my mother invited everyone over. Daniel came too. There was an awkward silence when I walked through the door. Then my brother approached me. I owe you an apology. I waited. I thought your business was small because I thought you were small. His voice cracked. I was wrong. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded. Thank you for saying it. That was all. No dramatic hug. No perfect family reunion. Just the truth. And somehow that was enough. Later that evening, my father pulled me aside. I still can't believe you loaned us $2 million. I smiled. I didn't do it because you were my family. He looked confused. I did it because 52 employees deserved a chance to keep their lives intact. He nodded slowly. Then I added, and because I wanted to prove something to myself. What? I looked across the room at my family. That I didn't have to become cruel just because people had been cruel to me. My father smiled. Years earlier, my family had laughed at my tiny office. They had called my business a hobby. They had told me I would never make it. Then, when their world started falling apart, they came to the woman they had spent years underestimating. I could have used their desperation to destroy them. Instead, I used my success to protect the innocent, expose the truth, and walk away with something far more valuable than revenge. I finally understood the real lesson. The best revenge isn't making people regret underestimating you. It's building a life so strong that their opinion no longer has the power to define you.